Welcome to the Danny Goldberg Rock and Rolls Hour. In this podcast, Danny shares his longtime connection to the path of the heart, as well as his very engaged life of social activism. If you are interested in supporting Danny's podcast, please go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/Danny.
Hi, this is Danny Goldberg, and this is Rock and Rolls. And this is the first time in a couple of years since I've been doing this podcast that I'm speaking to someone I haven't met before. It's a British singer and songwriter, Nick Mulvey, whose press person was kind enough to seek us out, and I'm very excited to talk to him because the lyrics in his records and the music he makes are very consistent with the kind of things that we've talked about here about the balance of spirituality, day-to-day life, social consciousness in this crazy world. He has a new album called Wake Up Now, which released worldwide September 8th, and it's got songs on subjects about refugees, about the protests at Standing Rock and the underlying issues, as well as a lot of other complicated and interesting subjects that you don't always hear in rock and roll or in pop music. So, welcome.
Thank you, Danny.
Welcome,
Thanks.
man. Thanks for doing it. So, tell me what are the influences as you were growing up and becoming an artist that got you defining music and songwriting in such a broad sense? Most songs are about love, romance, heartache, and teenage angst.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks for having me on the show here today. I've been a fan for a while, and I'm a fan of what you do, and I'm a fan of the podcast itself. And I appreciate the angle you take on sitting between rock and roll, pop music, and spirituality. So I'm really happy to be chatting with you here today. It's a real honor. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted that you know about it, and so happy to talk to you. So having said that, where do you kind of come from with all this?
I mean, I'm a very intuitive musician, you know, very, very kind of instinctive one. So as much as being brought up, the kind of musical furniture in my household was my parents' love of the kind of 60s greats, you know, from Bob Dylan, Beatles, Joni Mitchell, Van Morrison, Neil Young. So that was kind of like, you know, songwriting was kind of what I was brought up on. Paul Simon became my kind of first artist that I really kind of had these revelations that I knew what he was talking about.
And what was the first album of his that got to you? Was it Graceland? Because I certainly hear some Graceland in your music.
For sure it's Graceland. And it was this particular lyric. It was, this is the story of how we begin to remember. This is the powerful pulsing of love in our veins. After the dream of falling and calling your name out, these are the roots of rhythm, and the roots of rhythm remain. And I remember being about 13 years old and just thinking, I know what he's singing about. And before that, music had always been something where I would assume that I didn't necessarily know what they were talking about. So that was a revelatory moment for me, that you know, I knew what I felt like I knew what he was singing about. But I've always had a much broader exposure to music than just those influences. There was a lot of African music around my growing up. West African artists like Tumani Jibate and Ali Farka Touré. Albums like the Buena Vista Social Club were big in my growing up. And I also loved all of the hip hop that my friends and I were listening to, or we loved British bands like Oasis and Blur. I loved the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I loved all the pop music that my friends and I were absorbing. But I just loved music so much that I didn't stop, you know, my appetite was not limited, you know. So when I was age 15, my mum gave me an album, a Steve Reich album, Music for 18 musicians, super famous, minimalist, incredible piece of music. And if I can be totally candid with you,
not a lot of pop melodies in Steve Reich.
No, but he strikes so beautifully this balance between appealing logically to my mind and irresistibly to my heart.
Right.
Which all the music I love tends to sit somewhere in that balance. And that was game changing for me. I've always been a drummer, and I've always been a very instinctive drummer. And I was a pianist, as my love of jazz music, of John Coltrane and Miles Davis. I love the greats. I love greatness. I'm fascinated by every aspect of great artists and their careers and their lives and their relationship with inspiration. And Bob Marley was a huge one.
Yeah, I could definitely feel some Bob Marley, and especially in the lyrics and the way you approach issues. So you've got this song on the new album. It's called Myela. Is that how you pronounce it?
Exactly.
And it touches on the refugee crisis. And I know you're also involved with an organization dealing with refugees. It's such a compelling moral issue and so overwhelming to try to figure out how to live a life day to day and be a responsible human being. Talk about these things for a minute, because I think it's such a key part of this next album.
Yeah, I mean, well, writing this album as I did in the course of 2016, it felt impossible not to embrace some of these issues, But I kind of had this feeling of like I needed to do something. I needed to do anything to help, and I work within songs, and I wanted to. I knew some of my work should be in. I couldn't flinch. I couldn't turn away from these issues. But for the last since in my mid-20s, I discovered Ram Dass, and we can perhaps talk more about Ram Dass, as we go. And he led me to your podcast, and he teaches so much that the only thing you have to give is your state of being. And so this album is in many ways about it's about self-inquiry and self-understanding, and I look at these issues. It was a part of my journey of self-inquiry to actually, from my perspective, to become outward, and I knew I needed to write about this subject, basically.
Well, it's funny, as you Ram Dass been a big influence on me, and is certainly the spiritual source of this work I'm fumbling along to try to do. And there's that balance between looking within to whoever we are really, and at the same time having compassion and an ethical relationship to the world around us. And there's no easy answer in terms of how to create that balance, but I'm just curious, when you say you were influenced about how you've dealt with it. First of all, how did you come to Ram Dass? I'm always so interested. I'm such a child of the '60s, and it was so much sort of part of my coming of age, and his transformation mirrored so much of my own in terms of going from psychedelics to meditation and some other inquiries into ancient traditions. How did he get into your head?
I think I really smiled when I heard Ram Dass say that Maharaji is the fisherman and Ram Dass is the bait.
Right. Yeah.
but that's the background. I mean, literally, the way I discovered him was that friends of mine in the UK, an artist and an artist called Jamie Catto, who has made interesting films, and he spent time with Ram Dass and was making a film about him. So through him, I think I heard about Ram Dass, and then I just went on to YouTube one day, and as soon as I heard one talk, it switched the light in me, and I just couldn't get enough. And I was really hypnotized by how articulate by his articulate words, by his way with words, and just kind of immediately nourished by the intelligence with which he speaks, and I needed to hear what he talks about.
So again, so much of and this title of this, Rock and Rolls, is based on something he's been saying for so many years about that we're souls, not roles, and to identify of our true self. And all the meditation practices are trying to go beyond identifying just with the passing thoughts and the passing feelings to get to a more deeper, some say eternal sense of ourselves. But at the same time, life is going on, and you're making records, you're dealing with a label, you're dealing with the British music business, and hopefully the American and rest of the world's music business. You're dealing with the mechanics of having to create something that sounds good and satisfies yourself. You're dealing with budgets, you're dealing with the media, you're dealing with the launch of a record. And I think a lot of people in their own lives are trying to create that balance, to honor both parts of ourselves. Do you have any practice or any advice to give to people who are trying to balance these two things? Because it does sometimes seem to be a conflict.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of it now, I would say. So I don't know if I have any pithy advice, other than just being honest about my own experience. My own self-inquiry and my own practice, daily practice as a meditator, is very inseparable from my music, from my creating, and the act of being at the guitar is a meditation for me, and always has been, long before I ever knew any ideas about meditation. And playing the guitar and that meditation really kind of is the central point for the songs. The songs come from that, and so they, I often think of myself as the first audience member, which is to say that I'm writing the songs, but I'm also like finding what the songs are about. And it seems on this album, I really need to talk about these spiritual ideas and this spiritual framework as a kind of the role it has to play in all these changing times we live in. And I mean, having a daily meditation practice is essential. And in the times where it fluctuates, and in the times where it slips is normally in the times where life can be overwhelming. And it's one thing making music and honoring these urges, and then another thing interfacing with the commercial world and selling it. I haven't got all the answers to that right yet. Is the honest?
Yeah. Me neither. Talk more though about I feel I skipped over too quickly the crisis about refugees and
Sure.
the way that you're plugging into that issue. It's I find it again somewhat overwhelming and confusing, and at the same time I can only imagine what families go through who are suddenly displaced and not knowing how to eat or where to sleep, and fearing
Yeah.
for their physical safety. I get upset if I stub my toe, or, So, talk more about the organization that you've been supporting,
Sure.
and how you're thinking about the issue, and how we can be responsible human beings and still not get overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
Sure. I was kind of led to the song by something non-intellectual, by something not conceptual and no ideas. I had a chord pattern, a series of chords, which were loosely speaking kind of quite Spanish, quite flamenco type space, and they moved. The chord sequence kind of moved into something quite North African. So overall, it was quite a Mediterranean feel, this song, and that's not unusual for me to kind of everything, this wide-ranging appetite of music leaves its mark and its influence on me. But the melody line for this particular chord sequence was kind of intense. And every time over the course of the year when I was writing this album, I tried to write words to this melody line that were about my own life, my own, pretty tame fears and scenarios or aspirations. Like the intensity of the melody line seemed to dwarf the words. So I kind of I didn't want to let go of this chord sequence because it offered a very different color and a different space to the rest of the album. But I'd gotten all the way to the recording session and I still didn't have the words for this song. In fact, I had everything else. I had the structure, I had the chords, I had the melodies, I had everything except for any words. Right at the end of the chord sequence of the recording process, I took my band member, my musical collaborator, Federico Bruno, to one side of the studio, and I showed him this sequence, and I said, look, I've got every element of this song, but I don't have any words, and I refuse to kind of give it up for this album. What do you think? And we were in a small room just off the side of the recording studio, and I shared this song with him, or this music with him, and he commented that it felt quite Mediterranean, and it was like a light switch went on, with that particular word, the Mediterranean. And I realized that this could be a space on the record to talk about this subject. And in fact, then this sense of duty or almost obligation came with it, that we must talk about this. So we both hit upon that idea, and we agreed that it would take some research and we shouldn't do it lightly. And in actual fact, neither of us felt particularly worthy to write our own poetry about this subject. I mean, what do we know firsthand, experientially, about that degree of uncertainty that the refugees must feel? Or, who would we be to kind of presume to understand their experience? So rather than writing our own poetry about it, we put some time aside, we put a couple of days aside, and we just met up and we did some research into the subject, particularly focusing on first-hand accounts of refugees' journeys. Mostly there are these archives online on the UNHCR website.
So forgive the interruption. So the music drew you into the subject matter? Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
That's so cool. That's a.
Yeah, I mean, it's significant to me because I rarely kind of sit down and think, oh, what issue should I write about today?
Right.
It doesn't happen like that. I get immersed in my subject. It's not as much a kind of intellectual or mental process as that. Like I like to be led by the music to where I want to go, and sometimes the music leads me all the way. And in this case, it's true to a degree, but then at a certain point, we decided to focus the songwriting on this subject, and that's what I've just described to you. And then we got down to the process, and we drew. We felt like we needed to give voice to these stories we were reading, and we drew the lyrics of the song from these first-hand accounts. But we fictionalized these first-hand accounts. And
I'm sorry, where did you find the first-hand accounts?
Mostly on these archives of refugees telling their own stories of their own journeys, mostly Syrian, often Sudanese and Eritrean, Ethiopian people, Afghanistani people. There's a whole archive of these on the UNHCR website. That's the United Nations Refugee Agency website. And it wasn't hard on online, just on YouTube, to just look into Vice magazine documentaries about the refugee camps in Lebanon, and we would just like jot down things that we heard. We heard a 12-year-old boy from Nigeria say that he would rather die once in the sea than dying every day that he stayed back there. It was devastating, to really hear that from a child, from a person so young. And gradually this song came together, and the verses of the song seek to communicate with you these words. They seek to engage your mind and speak to you. Therefore, I felt it was important in the song to have some relief from that, and in the chorus. Sorry, it was important in the chorus of the song to kind of break with that mental element and just have a chorus that was a bit of a release, an energetic release. So what I did is I kind of sung whatever the melody line kind of wanted to bring forward out of inside of me, and it was the word Myela. And so,
and what does that word mean? Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm saying to you. Initially, it doesn't mean anything. It's a sound that fulfilled a function at that stage in the song, which was to engage with your heart and not your intellectual mind, which had been engaged with for those verses and would be re-engaged for the next verse to come. So as a break from that, I needed an energetic space that just felt right, felt like the right energy. So it's a kind of cry, and I just sing out Myela, Myela, Myela. So I didn't know what it was initially. Again, I'm being led by the music to these moments. Now, since living with the song and recording it and performing it and living it, I have my own personal understanding that Myela means the mother. It means the mother. It means it's a cry of despair to the mother in a broad sense, Mother Earth perhaps, or Mother Goddess, Mother, who else do you go to when you've got nothing else to, nowhere else to go?
So forgive me if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but so this word is sort of a word that just came to you? It's a new word?
Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah, that's so interesting. And you feel it's another name for the mother of the universe, which in essence is. So I read in your material, you said there's a lot about this organization, Help Refugees.
Exactly.
And talk about that.
Well, when it came to releasing the song as we did earlier this summer, I knew that I wanted to partner with an organization working in this field, so any profits we can make from the song would go to somewhere useful, B, to kind of help the song be understood out there in the world, to kind of for it to be most effective, for it to be spread around, through social media by people who are working in this sphere, for it to, it felt for a few reasons correct to collaborate with a partner. Once I made that decision, within the space of a week, several different contacts I have said, "Oh, you've got to meet the Help Refugees UK charity." So, we've partnered on this song, Myela, with Help Refugees UK, and they're a really interesting, fascinating organisation who started as a group of young Londoners who, in the end of 2015, felt the need to just go off their own backs to northern France, to Calais, where these unprecedented camps of refugees, which actually had been growing for some decades, were now reaching the size of a small city, and with all kinds of attendant health problems, and the situation was pretty dire, and they were a particularly kind of organized bunch of youngsters who ended up, I think the story goes, they rented a warehouse right nearby, and from that were able to receive like aid for the refugees, and they became, like, unwittingly, they became this organization right on the ground, working at the forefront of the refugee crisis, much more flexible and dynamic than the bigger charities, and able to respond to needs as and when they happen. To fight, when the weather got warmer, overnight they needed 10,000 bottles of mosquito repellent.
Right.
So they were able to really be in touch with those needs on the ground. And they've also done, increasingly a lot of political advocacy back in London, in Brussels, in Paris, working on the stagnation around the laws that would oblige governments to do more to support refugees. So they have a lot of different purposes, and they were definitely the right match for us.
Are they affiliated with Amnesty in some way? Or
I'm not sure how to answer that, because they might be. But
I thought I'd read that. It's no big deal. I just was curious if they were.
Pass. I think they have.
Yeah. My bad. So let's just talk. I want to talk about a couple of songs on the record before we talk about other things. And one of them that got my attention is "We Are Never Apart," which, as I understand it, was inspired by the protest at Standing Rock here in America. How did that issue get to your attention, and what's your thoughts about what are you trying to get at?
Well, I mean, I think through social media over here, the events at Standing Rock didn't feel particularly foreign or too far away. I felt I was observing it right, from all the way through, and still am in its own way.
Yeah.
I mean, the background is I have had a lifelong admiration for indigenous America, from north to south, like a kind of love of the textiles, a love of an enormous variety of cultural expression, and that chimes into a personal love of sort of pre-industrialized culture, where a necessary harmony between people and their environment is maintained, because of the greater dependence pre-industrialized people would have on their natural environment, So and often you find within indigenous America a worldview that places a living spirit very firmly at the heart of any perspective. And so, I've had a long love of that. I've had my own healings with ayahuasca and ayahuasca journeys in the UK, and been very deeply, profoundly moved and inspired by the healing traditions and their kind of their reaches across the world at this time. So that's the background. I felt very strongly, we were, watching in horror as this militarized police force operated on the behalf of a corporatocracy, in ruthlessly opposing these very, the natural protection of sacred land, and a further chapter in a long story. But then I was also astounded by the actions of the water protectors, and I was particularly moved by this by the presence of native groups in the role of protest. And I think it does relate to things that I've heard Ram Dass talking about, where he talks in his famous book Be Here Now. There's one page about the dissolving of a sense of us and them, and and what is the role of protest if there is no sense, if there's only us.
Right.
And I think that was reflected in Standing Rock in the evolution of the word protest into protectors. They're water protectors. I think, I mean, Standing Rock was a complex event on many levels, and on one level, it's about just standing up in an age of climate crisis to the retrograde forces still committed to fossil fuel extraction. So it contained that, as well as then the continual trampling on indigenous rights, indigenous sacred land. So I was deeply moved by it, and this song is really about is influenced, by Standing Rock, but also by these teachings from people like Ram Dass, like Osho, spiritual teachers. And the song really, it's called "We Are Never Apart," and it's about the mentality behind our decision, our ability to destroy our environment and destroy ourselves.
It's so interesting to me, the relationship between Britain and the U.S. I'm thinking about it a lot. I have a house in the country that was built in the 17th century before the Revolution. I think about both the Native Americans that were living there and the events that happened then. And of course, in recent history, there was a lot of people that thought that sort of the Brexit vote was kind of somehow mirrored by what happened here with Trump's election. And then there's some encouragement we Americans get from your last election, seeing a change in the balance. I'm not asking you to delve into politics, but I'm in terms of consciousness, there does seem to be these forces between hope and fear that go back and forth, and there is some shared culture that we have, not only the same language. I mean, what is, as somebody who's sensitive and tuned in, how do you sense the balance between those forces, and how can one most put their energy into the positive side? Because there's so much anger here in America by people that are not happy with our government, and I empathize with it, especially because of the suffering of certain groups. But on the other hand, anger doesn't seem to usually change things for the better, but neither does passivity. So I'm just curious, from a British point of view, how you're looking at the balance between these things, because there are a lot of similarities within the two societies.
I would say that whilst the nuances, are really interesting, meaningful, and we can talk about them between, the British perspective and the American perspective, I would say the general gist is that in this age of connectivity and immediate information, I don't feel the boundary too much fundamentally. Like Trump coming to power feels like it's happening for all of us.
Right.
I think we're all kind of like galvanized. I mean, I know climate change and does tend to affect some parts of the world more than others. Does tend to affect the poor more than the rich, but it is a global issue that involves all of us. So I heard the other day Russell Brand talking with Al Gore, and Al Gore was talking about these different stages of civil rights protests, from women's liberation through to the civil rights in the 60s, through to, all these different stages. And he was referring to them as the journey of the expansion of consciousness. This is the manifesting of the expansion of consciousness. We are growing through all this suffering. This is the growing pains of our re-understanding ourselves and our role in the world and in the universe.
Yeah, and if one is committed to democracy, which seems to be, I'm not a great Winston Churchill fan, but I did like when he said that democracy is the worst form of government except all of the others. If one's committed to a democracy, that means also that these sort of conversations have to somehow touch people outside of, for want of a better word, elite circles. and not everybody's going to read Be Here Now, and not everyone is going to be exposed to some of the things that you were exposed to growing up, but they're part of the community, and they affect what happens politically. And of course, over these last several decades that Gore and Brand were talking about, one of the things that has broadened some of these conversations is music. That music does seem to get into people's heads who may not read a particular book or, listen to a particular lecture or something like that. This is a weird turn in the conversation, but again, I'm somebody, I get these emails from your press guy of different articles about you and your bios, and I noticed in there that you had a dream where David Bowie came to you. And
Yeah.
One thing about David Bowie was he had a gift, one of many things about him, but one thing that's relevant to what I'm thinking about is that he had a gift for figuring out how to reach huge numbers of people with certain ideas and images. And certainly when he was first emerging in the public eye with blurring the lines of sexual identity and so on, it was quite radical, and it became completely, quite normalized in Western society within 15 or 20 years. What did talk about your feelings about Bowie pre and post Dream?
Well, growing up, he's such a cultural icon and a part of the landscape that I was well aware of him, but really only began my own deeper relationship with his work and with his art since his death, so
Right.
very recently. And I had a dream the week after my son was born. So it was a very heightened time, I wrote this album, Wake Up Now.
And your son was born 2 years ago, or
almost a year ago.
Oh, just 1 year. Wow.
Yeah, this was last September.
Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. He's an angel.
Yeah.
And so this album was written in parallel with my wife's pregnancy, and a week after he was born, I had this dream, and because we were waking quite a lot through the night with this newborn, the dream was fresh and vivid in my mind, and I was able to reach to the laptop and type it all out. And the dream was kind of part of a broader catharsis of creative release that was kind of triggered by the birth of my son. Part of it was quite practical about the late stages of the pregnancy when you make no plans and then you make even less plans and you're just at home being very manual. I was serving my wife and this baby to become, and I'd relegated my album and my writing to a very second priority, which in actual fact was a good
good for the art, probably.
Really good for the art. I got rid of my obsessing about it and my interference with it, and I was just cooking and I was washing, and then whilst I'd be hanging out the washing or whatever, I'd realize some really insightful thoughts about how I'd been perhaps limiting myself or creatively, or new lyrics would come. So, and then the baby actually was born, and I would be 99% focused on the baby, but in the brief 5 minutes per day I'd have anything else to do, I'd write half a song or something. So it was a very heightened time, and I had a dream where David Bowie more or less showed me on the guitar exactly where to place my fingers. It was a really vivid, surreal dream. I was at the back door of my parents' house in Cambridge in England, where I grew up, and someone sort of called to me over my shoulder, and I turned, and it was a kind of low era David Bowie in a fuchsia pink shirt with big buttons, and as I turned to him, I realized that I was holding this ukulele, and I was playing this riff that I had. It was a riff that I has become part of the album, and I was very pleased to see that this David Bowie of my dream was amazed by this music that I was making, and he was warmly kind of affirmative of this music. And I thought to myself, I remember thinking, shit, David Bowie's like digs my riff, and I remember him saying to me, this is ancient. It is ancient. he then encouraged me to transfer the riff from the ukulele onto full guitar shapes, guitar chords, which then the next day I duly did, and it triggered an outpouring of music and of creativity for me. So who knows how these mysterious things work? Definitely on one more material plane, I can see that my subconscious needs to speak to my conscious mind in these images, and it was the David Bowie of my psyche. I would, beyond that, I would be interested to talk with a widespread of artists as to how these artists like David Bowie or perhaps Prince have affected artists through their dreams before their deaths or indeed after their deaths. And there is such a thing as these subtler realms and the astral realm, and who knows how who knows
Yeah. One
so,
of my favorite spiritual teachers is named Bernie Glassman. He's a Buddhist, and he and Ram Dass, there's a couple of videos of the two of them speaking, and he created something called the Zen Peacemakers Order because he wanted to bring social consciousness and compassion to Buddhism. He had been trained in Japan and with all the Buddhist traditions, which I'm not that knowledgeable about. And the first tenet of his form of Buddhism is called not knowing, and and he developed this idea in conversation where he started to say always, in my opinion, he wanted to keep open the idea that he didn't know everything.
very smart.
So it's a helpful sometimes, particularly in show business. So the album's called Wake Up Now. Before we end, how do you wake yourself up? Any advice on how we can all wake ourselves up? Because I spend all my time forgetting and then remembering, and I would prefer to remember more and forget less.
It's funny, I mean, on one level, it's a ripening process of which you kind of have no control.
Right.
So acknowledgement of that and surrendering of that, it is an act of self-love. And so this album, I'm aware that within the title Wake Up Now, people could hear a kind of command, and within a command they could possibly hear a criticism, and like that unnerves me slightly because that's not where I'm coming from with it. The degree to which anyone else wakes up or the speed of anyone else's awakening, I kind of aware like has nothing to do with me, or it's not something I would rush or anything. But I do see that so many of these very disparate and complex global issues seem to have a common cause, which is a lack of self-knowledge. It seems to be so far and few between today that people are really talking about understanding that we are not this body, and we are not these names, we are not these roles, we are not these labels, and although we are those things, they're relatively true. They're constantly shifting, and
we're not only these things.
We're not only those things, exactly, and that's really meaningful. And I just think that the more people can spend time accessing, touching, feeling what it is you are beyond those labels, and through meditative means, through playful means, through the more we're going to touch the joy that has no opposite, as Eckhart Tolle says, and the more we experience the joy that has no opposite, the peace that is our true nature, the more we will make our actions from falling ever deeper in love with this experience of being embodied and being alive, and then we'll be making our actions from a place that doesn't add to the problem. I mean, that's again me coming back to Ram Dass saying the only gift you have is your state of being. If we act towards doing what we can in our lifetimes to counter climate change, for example, out of a sense of guilt, then we're going to be still inhabiting this mind frame that is actually where the problem came from in the first place. So the work has to be on ourselves, you know. But people often think, if I say that the best thing you can do to counter Donald Trump is to be honest about the Trump that lives within you, it sounds like quite a passive thing. But that's the mistake that we're evolving beyond right now, because to really every day, in every action, in every interaction between people, constantly be aware of your desire to self-protect or to take or to, you know, or any actions you do born from an identification with a limited self.
Well, I really appreciate that, and I think that's as good a way to end as any. I missed you when you were in New York. I was in California, and I know you got a UK tour and all that. But if you get back to New York, I hope someone will let me know. I'd love to see what you do in person and meet.
We'll get the dates to you, and you'll be very welcome to come to the city.
Yeah. Well done, man. I'm
New York
so excited to talk to you and admire so much the music. You know, because at the end of the day, the music is what drives all this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. All right. God bless.
Thank you, Danny.
Later.
Cheers.
Cheers.